Welcome everyone, my name is Meg and I finally finished the last dragon in my seasonal dragon series. I was able to build all 4 of these dragons within a year's time frame, so that worked out pretty perfectly. If you haven't seen any of my other dragon builds in this series, you're welcome to go check them out after this one. In this video, I'm going to show you how I built the winter dragon. This is not to be confused with the ice dragon I built years ago. I've had some people ask me if that was supposed to be the winter dragon, but no. I wanted it to be unique to this series. And just in case you were wondering why am I even building these dragons, it really is so I can practice building them because they are fun to build, and I simply enjoy making works of art in Minecraft. Right away in this time lapse, you'll see me create a basic form of this dragon. I did have a concept art I was going off of, one that I made myself. However, my concept art only featured the top of the dragon or just the head. I did do a quick sketch to get a general idea for posing, but a lot of it had to be figured out in-game. At first, I was pleasantly surprised at how quickly it seemed to be moving along, but that's all very deceiving before you get into the detailing. I always like to start refining my shapes at the face and work my way down the body. That way, once it's finished, I can use it as a better reference point for the scaling of the rest of the body and make sure it all fits together. For me, this process does involve a lot of hand smoothing, and given the fact that this organic is just a few blocks shy of full block height, it does take quite a while to do. Now you might be thinking, why not just model it somewhere else and import it into Minecraft? Then you will have a perfectly smooth model. That definitely would be easier, but I actually enjoy the process of doing things in-game. I like the hands-on experience, and I always feel more accomplished in the end. Everyone has a process for how to do things, this just happens to be mine. It took me a few tries to get a good shape for the legs. I wanted them to look like they could paddle water like a webbed foot, but I also wanted them to look strong like they could grip things. I don't know if what I ended up with displays all of those qualities, but I tried. Then of course, I have to repeat this process on all of the other legs. I would be lying if I said this didn't get boring sometimes, but when the process does get tedious, you just need that mental capacity to push yourself through it. It is a common problem where we struggle to stay motivated, and sometimes we get distracted on other projects or lose interest halfway through our builds. But if you just stick with it, you will be very glad that you did in the end. Even if it takes you longer than usual to complete it, just try working on it a little bit at a time, maybe even a half hour each day if that's all you can manage. Eventually, you will see progress and eventually, you will complete it. After many hours of building the body, I can finally start working on the fins. This was done mostly with the loft tool, and I do have a great tutorial for that if you're interested in learning more about that tool, but also involved a little bit of hand placing as well. I probably could optimize my processes a lot more, but I oftentimes just do whatever I'm feeling in the moment, and for me, that often involves a lot of hand building. I suppose I should try to explain at some point what type of dragon I am building. Honestly, I don't really know. All I know is it's meant to be an aquatic dragon, thereby it does not have wings. You could also classify it as a sea serpent or a leviathan, but I think all of those terms can still be defined as an underwater dragon. So there you go. You can call it any of those things. Oh, and you can also call him Stanley. He is the one dragon in this whole series that I've given a name and actually stuck with it. So I'm going to try to refer to him as Stanley throughout this video. Let's see how that goes. It's been the same basic process for all of these fins, but once I got to the tail, it was looking odd to me. Take a moment and see if you can figure out what's wrong. Here is what I discovered. After really referencing a bunch of photos of fish and how their tails are formed, the lapis, or the blue lines that you see separating the different parts of the fin, where they connected to the center line, I had them spaced out evenly at first. But then I realized if I have them all grouped together at one end, it looks so much better. Anytime I get a hunch that something is off, I'm usually right. It's just a matter of figuring out exactly what that is. after building way too many fins for Stanley, as well as modifying some of the existing fins, the last bit of shaping I had to do was for the belly, and this again, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do it, so I went with my first instinct, which was to do a basic scale-like pattern. These were built also using Loft, and I know it looks easy in the time lapse, but I did have to redo it a few times before I was satisfied. As one chapter closes, another one begins. After over 24 hours of shaping Stanley, I can finally start coloring him. And just like I did with the shaping, I'm starting at the face and working my way down. At first I thought about doing an initial coloring throughout the whole body, but then I opted for detailing it as I went. Poor Stanley is a blind dragon, so I got to try to experiment with how to build his eyes exactly. There is some blue ice surrounded by white glass to give it a glazed over look. Since I'm using all this white glass already, I needed something brighter to use as a highlight. And cobwebs make amazing highlights, especially since they are brighter than the brightest white block, which is snow blocks. Then it's always fun to see what other blocks you can mix in for detail, even if it is completely unnecessary. I don't typically build the inside of a mouth, so this was a lot of experimentation on my part for how to color this. At first I started with some deep reds and that just looked wrong. Then I tried more muted colors and they were too muted and had no pigment to them whatsoever. Then I opted for more pink blocks, but they're overlaid with brown glass so they're not too vibrant. And that looked pretty good. Despite Stanley looking very menacing right now, he does look rather nice, doesn't he? Especially when you see how well he takes care of his teeth. It took me a while to figure out how I wanted to texture the body because I knew for a fact I wanted it to be mostly white with blue accents. I ended up using teal accents instead because there's just not enough light blue blocks to make it look good, which resulted in me using a lot of cyan colored blocks. However, the main color is still white. Because this is an underwater dragon, I wanted it to look smooth and slippery and not too rough. But also, I wanted it to have some kind of texture where it didn't look too flat. I don't consider myself the best at texturing, I'm always trying to improve in that area, but the only reason my texturing would look decent is because I put a lot of thought and time into it. For example, when texturing the belly, I did use darker colors to contrast the body, and I was also consciously thinking about my gradient usage. My gradient started out with a certain palette at the top, but as I gradually got lower, my color palette would change, introducing darker blocks to that gradient. And with those base colors down, then I went over all of them again, this time with a much lighter block that would serve as a highlight. Again, I'm doing this because I was going for a shiny effect throughout this dragon. I felt the body texture was very boring and I tried adding a very bold scale pattern, but I ended up not liking that and defaulted to something more subtle. I do think about the build as a whole, but then there are times where I have to really focus in on one little section. Sometimes I even have to experiment or try different things until I settle on a texture that I like. When it comes to texturing, honestly, the sky is the limit. You could keep layering things and little detailed blocks infinitely if you wanted to keep building upon that texture and color. Some builders are great at this, getting all kinds of different colors and patterns by layering different blocks together. I try to use decorative blocks when I can, but honestly, for builds as big as this, it's not always necessary, especially when you're going to be looking at the whole thing from a distance, where those blocks won't be as noticeable. That's not to say I don't try to include any kinds of special detailed blocks. I think I try to use them sparingly. All this being said, there's so many ways you can texture and I'm by no means an expert, but the best way to improve is simply to practice. I don't know if you've seen any of my old builds, but the texturing on them is absolutely atrocious, and it's only because I've been making a conscious effort to improve my texturing that I've gotten to the point where I am today. Overall, this whole texturing process took over 28 hours, and I think it's very clear why, because of all of the fine detailing and hand texturing I did, but it does look so good in the end. I think all of that time paid off. By this point, Stanley is basically finished. I do have a few things I'm going to add to him later, but I do need to give him some surroundings. Just as it was shown in my original artwork, I want this dragon to be mostly underwater, but with just the head emerging, breaking through chunks of ice. So the first thing to figure out is how to do the water. My thought process here is he needs to be surrounded by water, but not completely covered by water, because I don't want to cover up all that beautiful texturing I just did. So I need to think of a creative way to hint at the water being there. I had this idea of the water swirling around him, kind of like a whirlpool, but not all the way around. And it was always my plan to build the water using the loft tool. But before I did that, I was doing some experimenting with other commands just for curiosity's sake and seeing if they worked. In the end, they didn't give the effect I was going for, but made some interesting patterns nonetheless. I tried for the first time this twist command, which was doing way too much twisting and just making a huge mess everywhere. Then I was trying things with the revolve command and the twist command combined, and it was looking very ugly because there was a lot of repetition of shapes everywhere. It just wasn't doing it for me. After about an hour of testing the water this way, I decided I should go back to my original idea of just using loft. However, I was trying something new again this time, where instead of setting it like a normal loft, I was using a noise pattern along with it, and that did give it an interesting texture with weird gaps in between, but still, it didn't look quite like water. With the swirling water still uncertain, I did know what I wanted to do on top, so I went ahead and added that. This is simply using a TerraGen command to create that wave pattern shape and then replacing above that with glass. And then I added a little bit of extra water along the edges using loft. I'm going to come back to the water though, because at this point I was kind of tired of working on it and needed to work on something else. I made a copy of the section of the build where I needed the ice, that way I could work non-destructively away from the main build. And I started with a regular loft command along the top, because the ice needs to be flat on top, that was my thinking. And then I masked all the blocks underneath of that, and used a boulder brush to create big chunks underneath. That was step 1. Step 2 is to divide this into smaller pieces using the Voronoi pattern. Some of these sections I painted separately because I intended on rotating them later on, so that would help me select them more easily. And then I cleaned up some of the edges. I am going to add more to this later, but this is good for now. Poor Stanley isn't fully here as I work on this ice. I only needed him as a reference, but ended up adding more of him later on so I could see it all together. Oh, there he is. It may look like I knew what I was doing with this ice, but really I had no clue how to make it look like I was thinking I wanted it to look. So I was playing around with a lot of different commands trying to figure out how I wanted it to look. I did think about the fact that the ice shouldn't be as broken except where Stanley is breaking through, so I did melt some of those shapes back together again and left the cracking more toward the center. Alright, now that I kinda have the ice figured out, it's time to go back to the water, because I knew this was going to take a long time using the method I originally planned. I did use loft earlier with that noise pattern, but it was looking too messy to me and not like water, and the alternative method is to do it the longer way, where I do one individual wave at a time, then I take a sphere brush and kind of shape the edges of it and kind of give it a spraying effect on the ends, and then I repeat this process over and over until eventually I'll get a shape of water that I like. I do plan on giving a more detailed explanation of this process in a future video, hopefully, so keep an eye out for that. The more of these shapes I added, the less and less I liked the noisy pattern behind. In the end, there was almost none of it left over. I basically redid the entire thing using this method. But I also ran into the problem of how exactly was I going to texture this water. Originally, I was going to have it just as glass, because glass is easy for water. But all of those beautiful flowing shapes weren't as visible when I was just using glass. So I decided to introduce some solid blocks for texturing as well. I kept the texturing very simple. It was mostly blue glass and lapis, but I did add some shading using lapis ore that was overlaid with some blue glass to lighten it up a bit. Of course, there are other blocks on the ends like white glass, and I did eventually mix in some panes too for a misty effect on the edges. But overall, it's a very simple palette. In the last few hours of building, I decided to work on the ice once again. You notice me going back and forth a lot because I was kind of getting tired at this point and I just wanted it to be done, so my focus was shifting around a lot. I built some smaller extra pieces of ice. The intention for these was to go along the edge of the larger piece of ice I had. Because it's so flat, you can't really see it unless you're looking from above. That's why I wanted to make some smaller pieces and angle them downward, just so you get a hint of more ice when you're looking at it from other angles too. Then after making another backup of my build, I've made several at this point because I've been very afraid of messing it up, I pasted everything together and now it is 98% done. I still have to add extra water splashes and other texturing to make Stanley look like he is truly in this environment. Some of the splashes I just sort of guessed where they would go, and others I thought more critically about what particular path some water particles would follow. Aside from that, the finishing touches to the build are extra cobwebs on the upper half to make the dragon look extra shiny up there because, you know, he's wet. And the other thing, which I had been struggling with the entire time of building this, was figuring out a way to make the lower half of the dragon look like it was submerged without completely ruining the texturing down there. Right now, the dragon doesn't necessarily look like it's getting wet underneath. It's all the same color throughout. So I needed to figure out a way to make the colors a little bit darker underwater to kind of emulate that they are wet. I opted for overlaying the main body shape with some blue candles. That way it doesn't necessarily interfere with all of the texturing I did, but it does introduce this blue hue along the edges. Just enough blue to match the blue in the wave around it. Speaking of the wave, I decided I still didn't like it. So here's a quick update to that. I added some more volume toward the lower half and also added additional colors to it to transition into a more teal blue. It now has a more natural shape as well as more realistic coloring. Even though this wasn't too bad before, I think this has improved it just a tad where I like it even better, and with that, Lord willing, I can call this build finished. From a distance it does look pretty simple, but I did put approximately 70 hours or more into this project. And now the question I've been waiting to ask for the past year: which of these seasonal dragons is your favorite? Again, if you haven't seen the time lapses for the other dragons in this series, you should definitely check them out. But since we are at the end of the winter dragon build, of course we have to finish it off with a cinematic view of this wonderful build and a 360 render to see it in its full glory. Thank you all very much for watching. I enjoyed this series immensely, but I'm also really looking forward to working on other things, and I hope I was able to inspire you with these dragons. I bid you farewell. Stanley will bid you farewell in just a moment, but I hope to see you again in the future.